Over to you, Clayton.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. So I must apologize in advance. I've got a very iffy Wi-Fi connection, and it seems to kick off every 20 minutes or so. So if that does happen, I promise I will reconnect as soon as possible. So with all the pleasantries out of the way, let me first greet everybody and say good afternoon. I am a master's student at the University of Cape Town, and my research involves the logic for artificial intelligence. So I'm also a part of the research group, Knowledge Representation and Reasoning at the University of Cape Town. What I want to do is I will switch off my video feed for the duration of my presentation. And at the end, I will switch it on again to field questions. So let's get that out of the way. All right. I will begin with a motivation for this work, and then I will make this concrete by looking at reasoning examples of 3 different formalisms of logic in AI. After that, I will explain our research methodology, discuss pertinent results, and conclude with a summary of our key findings. Right. So firstly, I would like to make the distinction that computers think and reason in ones and zeros, while humans do not. In the artificial intelligence community, one of our broad aims is for computers to mimic human reasoning. So my question to you is the following. How do we bridge the divide between human reasoning and reasoning in AI systems? One approach that comes to mind is by constructing a computer-readable language which represents the syntax and semantics of a human language, such as English. And this has been done in the form of classical or monotonic logic, where facts are represented as variables, and more complex sentences are represented by combining variables with logic operators. However, this is not sufficient when we consider the reality that no 2 people reason in the same way. Our approach investigates empirically the class of non-monotonic logic, more aligned to capture the diversity of human reasoning. So let us look at a few examples. In our first example, let us consider the following statements. Employees pay tax, employees report to a manager, Alice is an employee, and Alice works in an office. The question here is, can we conclude that Alice pays tax? In the classical case, the answer is yes, given that Alice is an employee and employees pay tax. And this conclusion will never change in the classical case. However, in the defeasible case, the answer is both yes and no. Should we receive additional information that Alice is not a typical employee, defeasible reasoning allows us to change our conclusion to be that Alice does not pay tax. In this case, we have to amend our knowledge to account for the information that employees typically pay tax and the information that Alice is not a typical employee. In our next example, let us consider the same statements as before. With belief revision, we can conclude that Alice does pay tax. But suppose we learn the new information that Alice does not pay tax. This information is inconsistent with our beliefs, and under belief revision, we have to decide which beliefs to accept and which to retract from our knowledge to get rid of the inconsistency. One approach is to include in our knowledge as a separate belief the fact that Alice does not pay tax. In our last example, we consider something different. Suppose our beliefs contain either of the following 2 pieces of information. Either the book is on the shelf and the magazine is not on the shelf, or the book is not on the shelf and the magazine is on the shelf. So here one of the items is on the shelf, but not both. Now suppose we send a robot to report on the state of the shelf, and it reveals that the book is on the shelf. With belief revision, we would have reason to conclude that the book is on the shelf and the magazine is not on the shelf. Instead, suppose we ask a robot to ensure that the book is on the shelf. After reporting, we have the situation again where the book is on the shelf, However, the thinking here is not straightforward. It could be that the book was already on the shelf and the magazine was not, in which case the robot would have done nothing. Or it could be that the magazine was on the shelf and the book not, in which case the robot would pick up the book and place it on the shelf. The result of the book being on the shelf in these two cases stem from different states of the world. And this is the idea behind belief update. So a dynamic shift in the world has occurred, and our resolve is to choose the set of beliefs which closely represent the state of the world after the change. So this brings us to our research question, which says, it asks to what extent do the postulates of defeasible reasoning, belief revision, and belief update correspond with human reasoning? For each of the three forms of non-monotonic reasoning, postulates or axioms exist which guide reasoning under these systems. These postulates are formulated in propositional logic and can be seen in the three tables on this slide. Notice how they link with a picture of the philosopher Socrates. Our approach is to investigate whether these postulates hold in human reasoning. So I'll unpack our approach in more detail, over the following slides. So firstly, we require empirical data to answer our research question. We chose to collect data via 3 distinct surveys, one for each form of reasoning. And these surveys were conducted virtually through Amazon's Mechanical Turk platform. The task in each survey was the same. So it asked, given a set of statements, participants were asked whether they agreed with the proposed conclusion. The material for each survey was obtained by instantiating the postulates of defeasible reasoning, belief revision, and belief update with concrete statements in the form of a story, like in our earlier examples. The conclusion in each case would be derived according to the target postulate. In our analysis, we extracted the data from our surveys and grouped it into its quantitative and qualitative components. The quantitative component involves the participant agreement with each conclusion, measured as yes or no. And our measure of success was called a hit rate, which determined the percentage of participants who agreed with the conclusion of a particular postulate. Each postulate was presented in an abstract and concrete form. In the case where the hit rate exceeds our baseline of 50%, for both the abstract and concrete case, we found a postulate to have correspondence with our participants' reasoning. The qualitative component, on the other hand, involves the open-ended explanations given by our participants for their agreement with the conclusion. These explanations were scrutinized for overarching themes and coded into categories which we would later identify as normative explanations or descriptive explanations. So let us have a look at some of our results. In this first graph, we see the hit rates for the postulates of defeasible reasoning. The black horizontal line indicates the baseline hit rate. Each postulate was presented in concrete or story-style form, and then also in abstract form or symbolic form, as we've mentioned earlier. The concrete case is shown first for each postulate, followed by the abstract case in alternate colors. If we look toward the middle of the graph, we see that the postulate of or exceeds the baseline in both the abstract and concrete case, and it is the only postulate for defeasible reasoning that corresponds with our participants' reasoning according to this approach. In this next graph, we show the hit rates for belief revision. We found that 3 of the postulates, success, closure, and vacuity, have correspondence. And in our last graph, we show the hit rates for belief update. And we found that half of the postulates, or 4 of them, U1, U3, U4, and U6, have correspondence. All right, so in this slide, we summarize the key findings from our research. With some exceptions, we observed that the concrete hit rate exceeds the abstract hit rate across the 3 forms of reasoning. This corresponds to our understanding that human reasoners tend to think in pictures and words rather than in symbols, which computers use. After analyzing the codes developed for the explanations, we find that a descriptive style, reasoning about how the world is, was prevalent in our participants' reasoning. For belief revision, we found that a normative style, how the world should be, the typical world, was prevalent in our participants' reasoning. And in the belief update survey, we took a different approach. We tested 4 counterexamples to the postulates and found that all 4 counterexamples conform. So it's encouraging to see that from our work, there is some correspondence between these 3 forms of non-monotonic reasoning and our participants' reasoning. So whilst the correspondence is not a perfect fit, our research paves the way for the future study where the correspondence can be determined for a particular group of participants with controlled settings such as age, gender, and education, or where the correspondence can be confirmed with a larger sample of participants. So that brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you for your attention. Are there any questions?
Cool, thank you, Clayton, for the interesting talk. I see Joel Hamilton has a question.
Hi,
Joel.
really nice talk, Clayton. Thanks for that. It was really interesting. I just wanted to ask, why did you guys use 3 different surveys? Were some surveys more aligned with to check a particular reasoning approach than the others, or was it just to make things clean and easy for the people doing the surveys?
Thank you for your question, Joel. I think it's a very interesting question, but it has a very simple answer, in that our work was a combination of 3 separate studies. So I was working with 2 of my colleagues, and we each looked at a specific form of reasoning. So I looked at
Oh, I think his internet may have dropped.